Well, thanks, man. I'm glad to be here. It's one of the things that I've always looked forward to. Actually, making YouTube is the collaboration and talking with YouTubers and stuff like that. I always thought that was very interesting, looking from the outside before I had a channel. Um, but whenever I tried, it just didn't work out.
Oh yeah, I mean, like I think that's one of the biggest, at least here in America, that is like a huge problem, where collaborations happen and then they get they like implode in on themselves,
Hmm.
and then the parties split and they become very hostile towards each other. It's
Yes.
very weird and obviously contradictory to the teachings that we all hold. It's a very unfortunate circumstance that happens, and I can understand why from an American perspective why that happens.
Yeah, it's a universal problem. Like our channel had three guys starting out, but then one of them got angry at the other guy, and then we just had two guys. Yeah. So hopefully this is here's to a new era, right, of collaboration. Yeah.
Yeah, like it's I know this word has kind of been weird, but like fraternity seems to be missing.
Yes.
Like, and obviously not in a Masonic sense, but in a true,
Brotherhood.
yeah, brotherhood. Yeah, that would be a much better word for that. Um, and so like I don't know if you have something like this, but in terms of like my own spiritual development, I did Exodus 90, and Exodus 90 is something that started here, and it's slowly starting to like branch out, but it's 90 days before.
I did it. I did it. Yeah,
Oh, you
did it
did it.
last.
Oh, you
Yeah,
did it.
yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah.
like the fraternity I established with the brotherhood that I established really with my friends. I guess like that's kind of like the angle I'm looking at it from. And so whenever I see these disputes happen, it's like, well, you guys are going in the same direction. You know,
Mhm.
what are you doing?
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah. It's even worse when you look at it from when reading history, right? And then you see like the Crusades, for instance, and then you see the Knights Hospitallers and the Knights Templars literally killing each other for little forts, and then allying with Muslim powers around them uh,
yeah,
to,
yeah,
to kill each other for like these forts in the middle of the Outremer, right? The Crusader kingdoms. Like you're reading these texts and you're like, guys, what are you doing? It's hilarious how this works out, how things can just spiral out of control like that. I think it's like a short-term vision kind of thing when short-term interests,
yeah.
and personal interests and mystery of iniquity and all that. This is something I struggle with a lot. Is academically, I'm trained because being more in the humanities. I know that you're more of a scientist, which I always wanted to be, but I never had the inclinations for that. But in the humanities, we're trained a lot to see things from this very modern perspective as a system, right? Where you have environmental factors and greater realities above human sin or nature that determines human options, right? Geography or whatever,
Right.
physical laws and whatnot, and that's actually true a lot of the times because environmental factors and tendencies of history do limit the options that humans have, and thus you can more or less explain the options that people will take or have taken on those terms. But we also can't forget um, human decision making as a major factor, and as a result, the flaws of human decision making, right? Sin, and also the good side, virtue, and how these things can determine historical outcomes, and even the success of an entire culture is the decisions on that culture and the leaders of that culture were willing to take. My father's an economist, and he hates it whenever I suggest that economics is an ethical factor, and the ethical character of a people often will determine economic outcomes. And he doesn't like that very much. Being a trained economist, he doesn't like that one bit.
Well, so the I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. So like that's very interesting because like I knew several people when I was going in my undergrad and grad school, several economists, and the assumption is always, obviously everyone's a rational person and they're making decisions for themselves and all that stuff. And it's like I've always thought that to be a logical premise. I always thought, well, people are selfish and they'll do what they want for themselves, but that doesn't make them rational. that makes them, I mean, unless we're simply saying that by rational, they make decisions, which I think is too broad of a term for what they're trying to say. Because then you can't say what you're saying, which is there are ethics involved into choosing, I want, item A over item B because item A is made ethically and doesn't pay, child labor, and item B is, whatever that is. So, I mean, is that would that be a fair way of interpreting what you're trying to say to your?
Yeah, I think so because I think economists, for one thing, they try to see it as a science or something maybe in between. Like some people argue that it's more in the humanities, people argue that it's more in STEM fields or something in between. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But some would say that economics is the summation of human relationships. And so a lot of the times, like when you're looking at how the market works, trust, confidence, things like that, which are very abstract,
Yeah.
right, of the human spirit, they determine economic factors. So it becomes difficult to see it in purely mechanistic terms of what's happening economically. The movie Big Short, and I actually wanted to comment on this on my channel eventually. I actually posted it as an option for my patrons, but they didn't vote for that one. But I think the movie Big Short, showing the '08 financial crisis, the impression I got is that the cause was very much a moral issue. Like when you look at how the movie positions how the crisis happened, it's a culture of excess, and people are spending money they don't have, and they're spending money they don't have because they want the big life. They want several. Like when you look at people that don't have the means, they're buying houses, and the banks have an incentive to allow that because they also get in on the money. And deep down, and in the end, they realize that the government's going to bail them out, even if they give off these crappy loans and stuff like that, right? So then the taxpayer has to. All that is a moral issue. Like how can you explain that in pure mechanistic terms? Like okay, so the banks decided to give money they didn't have, and people decided to buy houses with money they didn't have. That's imprudence, right? That's imprudence. And with that, the global economy went to the hills, right? Right. Um, and you see moments like that, and you see different cultures. They have a tendency of choosing different economic options. Like some cultures that are more willing to do the hard work, like in East Asian stuff like that, they tend to be. And then other cultures where that might not be necessarily much of value. Like I'd say my culture in many ways.
I just want to clarify. Your culture is in Brazil.
Yeah.
Okay. You're from Brazil, but right now you're in Europe, right?
Yes. I'm both Brazilian and European. I'm dual citizenship. But yeah, I mean, I'm being unfair. The Brazilians are a very hard worker. I mean, it's a very hard working culture, and we also like the working hours are actually longer than in Europe. I would say though that culturally we have a tendency of thinking things in very much the short term, and not very much a long term culture kind of thing. Like a lot of the times, our entire economic position has been determined by, I think, the vices of the elite political class. It's a cliche, but I do think that's the case because in Brazil specifically, the after the empire was abolished, the political class they benefited from screwing over the rest of the country, over keeping it deindustrialized to incentive to benefit the landowners and the agriculture sector and stuff like that.
Right.
And so that's an example of of short-sighted men not seeing things in a broader picture, getting in the way of things benefiting for everyone in a group, right? I don't want to sound like a communist or anything like that. Like that's
No, I get what you're saying because like a similar
yeah.
thing happens here, but I've recently pulled back and been like, it's probably not a short term play. I mean, it looks like a short term play, but it's probably not a short term play. Like for example, in Michigan, so this is where I'm from in the United States. Our governor basically pushed through a bill really fast to allow a company from China owned by the CCP to have a place here, and it's The reason why she did it so fast was because there would be retaliation. Like, there are people protesting that. And short term, that looks like, all right, she's providing jobs through this means from someone who's has a lot of money. And kind of like in one of your videos, where we'd be, the average worker would be happy in America to have to work under foreign powers, while at the same time getting weaker in the economy and such. That's kind of happening right now here, and in our state. And the long term play, I'm very cynical when it comes to politics. I don't think it's a short term play. I don't think the justifications that they're given are to make money and just to benefit her, to make her look like the next presidential candidate after Joe Biden. I think it's a long term play that does boil, that does, go on the line of what is it, a metal tinfoil hat. But I've also seen, in America here, I grew up during a time when racism wasn't really an issue. Like, it was, but it was like a very minor issue. And then in 2012, it just blew up. And it was from a top down, like exactly how you described it. It was a top down thing. And so it's, there are plenty of examples that I think support your hypothesis on that.
Thanks, man. Yeah, the not everything short term, and of course you have covert interest in different groups, especially in an open society like the United States. It becomes very easy for you to form different political identities, different political groups and factions within the United States that might not have the interest of the nation as a whole. Because if free assembly, right, and free speech, and people can think whatever they want, and people can talk to whoever they want, and form groups and whatever, then obviously you can easily subvert the entire system by being able to create groups within the United States that want to destroy the United States from the inside out. And this is not a conspiracy theory. Like, you have groups that are Marxists and socialists and whatever within the United States, and they're free to have their own opinion. And their opinion is the United States has to be destroyed. And the United States itself tolerates that. Now, this will be interesting because if the United States, which I'm not sure, like no one can predict the future, but unless you have the gift of prophecy, which I do not have. But if the United States were to collapse soon, or balkanize, or weaken severely, which some people seem to think it could happen or not, if that would be the case, then the United States would have a shorter lifespan than the Spanish Inquisition as a whole, which lasted like 3 centuries. And the Spanish Inquisition is just one institution within the Spanish Empire, and if that would be the case, if America would collapse in the foreseeable future, then that would perhaps indicate that there's a reason why institutions like the Inquisition existed in Spain, and some institutions in China, and throughout history, many different empires existed. And maybe that, whether I like it or not, if we were to have like an impartial view of history and civilizations, maybe that's one of the reasons why civilizations tend to censor, because that would extend its longevity. But we would have to see. I would love for the U.S. to be able to get out of the situation that it's in right now, and prove that no, like maybe with freedom is self-correcting, and that could be the case as well. Like, that would be great. But I don't have enough data, because the U.S. is one of the oldest governments in the world right now, right? It's like 200 years old. It's a young country, quote unquote, but it's a very old government. Like
Yep.
Germany, France is an older country, but the government is a lot younger, right?
Yeah, I think by like 20 years.
Yeah, exactly. And China's a good example. Like, people go like, "Oh, China's an old civilization." Yeah, but the government's like as old as my grandmother, right? So America is actually a very old force. The American government itself. I've received ridicule in my channel, my comments for this. Whenever I refer to America as a very old institution, it's a very old force in the world. People go like, that's a joke. No, it's not. Like name a government that's like 200 years old. Like, you'd be hard pressed. And so as a result, I do think we're reaching kind of like the limit of the American system right now. personally, and I think America has two options, and one would be the Roman route, which would be to reinvent itself under new conditions. Um, uh, America, Rome went from a monarchy to a republic, then to an empire, right?
Yep.
And America would have to transition to a different form of government, but still paying homage to its old roots, or just balkanize. But I don't know what's. I used to think America would balkanize more. Now I think maybe I don't know. Like maybe it could transition. Sometimes America looks very stable. Sometimes it looks less stable. I guess being more transparent than other countries, it makes it look like America's just about to fall, but then it doesn't, and that's always impressive. That's why I admire the United States a lot for this reason. But I do think that if the global order collapses now, I think America would probably be preserved. I think it might be like how Byzantium was, right? With the fall of Rome. Byzantium was a relic of the older world order, as the rest of the world went into chaos, and then after a while established different kingdoms and different groups, and the Arabs came on the scene and stuff like that, the Franks, and I think we might see something like that when the global order as we know it might change. America is preserved somewhat, but things will change globally into something else. And America will also reflect how the world works. If for instance, the modernization system collapses
Mm-hmm.
and things are taken over more and new feudalism returns with giant corporations, right, taking over large swaths of land, that would affect the United States as well. And I'm pretty sure American corporations would be one of those really big powerhouses that would be taking over large parts of the world. Like if different countries collapse, like BlackRock would just buy entire countries, which might be happening right now already. Some say BlackRock is like the third like the third largest economy in the world, and it's like a corporation,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And that's something to think about. But yeah, sorry, I don't want to ramble on for too long.
No, it's okay. It's fine because like it's very interesting to have someone who isn't from America to give a description of America. Uh, I find that fascinating because in America, we have this incredible tendency to censor international news and international opinions from the like main media outlets. We very rarely get international news, or obviously, unless we're involved in some conflict like Ukraine. We don't tend to the BBC listening reading the BBC outside of Doctor Who does not actually happen on a massive scale, and so we have a lot of localized news to just our country, and then so like I make a point to try to get informed on things, but there's only so much I can do. So whenever I have the opportunity to talk to someone who isn't from America, and the way you're describing it is very interesting to me because I keep looking at America in the same way, where I'm like, we're gonna collapse soon, because we are prioritizing like we have first world problems that are inherently first world and even unique to us, and we're putting them in front of actual progress, as in like not from a left right perspective, but progress as in like to build ourselves up. We're in fact doing the complete opposite, which is one of the reasons why I brought up the racism comment, because that is starting in 2012, like that really started to bring us down as a country, internally at least, and then with the certain identity crises situation, that is not at all helping, and it seems to be multiplying the effect. The difference though is that on a local scale, like in school boards and stuff, parents are fighting back, and there's a tenacity there that has been dormant. And so when you say there's a possibility for like a reformation within the country, that's where I think it's going to come from. And if we ever got into an actual war, most, if not all of this stuff would just stop. Like it would just go away. We can't have this. It's not going to be useful. Stop talking about this. Like that's kind of how I envision like that would happen, because you're seeing it now on a lesser scale, but people aren't being threatened.
I think the big wild card in the United States, other than I think the corporations in the tech sector, right? Because technological innovation can come up with things that completely change how things work. So, like, who knows? Silicon Valley might pull something out, right, of a rabbit hat that might make some things easier, some things more difficult, but who knows? But I think, like, I thought America was going to go a certain way because uh, 'cause I read a lot of Machiavelli, right, during when I was doing my master's back in university, and Machiavelli in his discourses and stuff like that, when he talks about how a republic has to work and stuff, a lot of the times it almost looks like he's describing the United States, right? So, but he's actually describing Rome, and America famously was inspired by the Roman example, being mostly a rural country at first, right, of a citizen aristocracy of landowning males that were able to vote and that were citizen soldiers, right?
Right.
And then you, as America evolves, the citizen soldier tradition is kind of abandoned in Vietnam. Could be wrong, but then the draft is abolished, right? Because you try to apply the draft for certain wars, and then the American population, they don't accept being drafted into these wars anymore. So they realize that if they drop the draft and they form a professional military that's mostly just based on volunteers, they can wage more foreign wars without such a backlash from the population, right? And so that's why they can invade Iraq without as many problems as Vietnam had, stuff like that, right? Okay, am I right? No.
Well, so like from just a, we never really got rid of the draft in the sense that like it's still legal, it can still be enacted.
Okay.
It's just the president has chosen to, the president and Congress has chosen to
Obviously, yeah.
prioritize or prefer. So because like there's an actual debate, you know, there's debates that happen about letting women get drafted or not and amending the Constitution. Like that discussion actually still happens. It's just I just wanted to clarify that because
Oh, okay. All right. So what happened after Vietnam was like, was conscription dropped, or because I remember reading something about this.
the draft is still legal, but how we conscript is different now because that's part of our Constitution, and without an amendment, we can't actually like remove it as an option.
Oh, okay. Right. Right. Okay. Yeah, because the Constitution was drafted with citizen soldiers in mind, right? So, exactly, which is as Machiavelli correctly points out, it's essential for a free republic. But so basically, what happens is, right, so you have an emphasis on a professional military class. So uh, Machiavelli, he explains that when you have that, it's only a matter of time before the professional class just takes over. Because politics is mostly based on, as St. Paul says in the letter to the Romans, right? The state does not bear the sword in vain, and the sword is very much an element of the state. So it makes the state the state. It has the right to use the sword, right? Um, and so basically, the reason why the citizen soldier tradition is so fundamental to a free republic is because if the common man is not essential to the exertion of the power of the state, the common man will not participate in the power of the state. So when you create a different professional class of soldiers, which is different from the common man, it's only a matter of time before the class differences, before their interest as a military class then takes over, which is what happened with Rome. In Rome, the professional military class, they become loyal to their commanders, to their imperators, right?
Yeah.
Uh, Rather than the city itself. And so then you have the imperium, then you have the empire, right, which is literally named after a military rank of the empire. So it's basically a military dictatorship. So I thought that was very not necessarily a dictatorship, maybe like a military oligarchy or something like that was going to happen in the United States. Now I'm not so certain because like when I look at the ideological capture or the tendency of the very comfortable position of the American officer class, I'm not sure if they're going to find in their interest to take over the country or if they're just going to I don't know, like they might be comfortable as the way things are.
So
So,
I have a comment to that because like I think that's very interesting that you bring that up, and I think that has to also do with what I had mentioned earlier, where we get a lot of few international news outlets in America, you know, in mass. When people are running for, say, president, so president becomes the chief of the military. It's a citizen who becomes the chief of the military. He's not part of the bracket of going up unless of course he previously was part of the military and then gets elected by the people. But what's very interesting, I always notice this, looking at the different presidents since I've been alive is that they'll make promises, like military promises, and then the second they go in there, they just don't get enacted. They don't move. They just sit there, and it's like they get privy to information that they may not have been privy to, but also, it does bring up, like, not to sound conspiratory, but the idea of that arm of the government, pushing pushing behind the scenes, and that's, I'm saying that as an option, not as something that definitively happens. It's just a matter of, you have to hold that as an option if we were discussing this.
Well, yeah, it's the entrenched bureaucracy, right? I mean, that's what the deep state is. I mean, you have certain people that they're not elected; they're just part of the entrenched bureaucracy in the United States, and they determine. But like the elected political class of politicians, I don't think they're really in charge. A good example is what happened in the DNC primaries, right? Like Bernie, the people wanted to vote for Bernie like twice, right, during the DNC primaries, and the bureaucrats in the DNC just didn't want that. They wanted Hillary, and they wanted Biden, right? That's not a conspiracy. It's just it's a tendency of it's a tendency of when a system is reaching its end that it doesn't work the way it was intended to work because certain elements, because things change, and then certain people in certain offices gain more power than others,
Yeah.
and that's just natural. It's not a conspiracy. When you point out that maybe a government is not working as it's supposed to work, you're not having a tinfoil hat. You're just having an impartial, or you're having your own perspective on how things are falling apart.
Well, so like with the Republican Party, the same thing happened, except it happened with Ron Paul. I didn't vote for Ron Paul, but he was by far the number one person for two primaries in a row. And so a very similar thing happened to him with the Republican Party. So it's not just like, that's why sometimes people will say, well, we have a unilateral party. They just make it look like we have two. And that seems to be the case in terms of how they go about, like, once they're in office, like what they actually do. And that's why I think, for example, like Trump was such a wild card for, I guess, the beginning of his presidency, because he didn't hold the same standards as the others. That now, I don't know, but I mean, I have no idea. But I'm just saying, like, to emphasize your point of, once it gets to a certain point, it's not just one party, because some people, especially in America, like, will say, because you're criticizing the Democratic Party, that it's only the Democratic Party. It's not. It's very much the Republican Party too.
Yeah, both the bureaucracy in general, like the bureaucrat as a class, I think is something that we don't really analyze a lot in our modern era, which we should, because it's one of the driving elements of a modern nation state is the bureaucracy. And sometimes some people think, oh well, the corporations, right? The architect of the merchant, he like the corporation, that's the one that actually runs America because of lobbying and stuff like that. Could be, but one perspective that you also can have is actually the reason why corporations have to lobby the government is because they have to pay tribute. They have to pay money for the government, for the bureaucrats in power to decide whether or not to allow them to do something simple as to allow them to do their own business, right? You have this a lot in Brazil, where there is a lesser known debate going on in my country, where some people they blame the people on the left, blame the corporations for corrupting the government, because there's a lot of corruption everywhere, right? And some people blame the bureaucrats. They say, well, the bureaucrats, they only let the companies do their business if they bribe them. So it's on the initiative of the political class, of the bureaucrats in charge there. Some people say, well, actually, no, it's the corporations. They're the ones that muddy the waters when they bring money to the table.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of the times it's a chicken and the egg kind of thing. But I think one of the reasons that made the United States such a powerful nation is that it's not just a nation; it's also an international market.
Yep.
Which is why you have people like Elon Musk and the CEO of Google and a lot of very powerful foreigners, right, in the United States, right, that control these massive companies from Tesla to Google and stuff like that. And they're foreigners. They're foreigners. And as a result, the reason why China and Russia, I think, are destined to lose against the United States is because the United States you're not just, if you fight against the United States, you're not actually fighting against the United States. You're fighting against the global billionaire class who all prefer to park their money in the US.
Yep.
Like Chinese billionaires to Indian billionaires to like everyone all over the world. Like wealthy people from all over the world, they have more of an incentive to in the American system, to preserve the American system, than they do the Chinese or the Russian one. So so as a result, when things get difficult in any of these countries, they just, like, they're wealthy, they all leave to Canada, to America, to Europe, everyone, like all the rich people that they just leave, and that creates capital flight, right?
Yes, but I would say like there's been recent movements to move the dollar away from, like, I'm just using this, moving the dollar away as the international currency. I can't remember the countries, but basically, China.
BRICS, yeah, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're pushing for moving that away because, like, we are very. I would argue, I know we're talking about economics now, but I would argue we're in a very vulnerable position, given especially the policies of the last 3 years under Biden, and even part of Trump, with how generous we've been with, like, basically making money up. Again, that's more of like an inflation conversation.
When Lula, our president, talked about de-dollarizing and stuff like that, that's actually more complicated, even in Brazil itself. We're not sure if it's going to be able to be even possible. I mean, it could be a false alarm because these things have happened before when people have threatened to move away from the dollar. But let's see that right now it could be different. It's very much an end of an era. I do think, although I think that the U.S. is going to be better than a lot of other countries, I think the world itself is going to go through very difficult times, I think. But the U.S. is still going to be on top in many ways. Maybe I don't know because whatever issue the U.S. has, I think a lot of other countries are a lot worse.
Well, yeah, because we, like, influence our state of influence is crazy, like, and that's like one of the reasons that's one of the reasons why I will occasionally call us Babylon, because we do culturally colonize, and we do it in the wrong way. Like, I mean, like, it's not like the conquistadors when they came over and they were promoting Catholicism in Spain and along with the French and whatever. In this case, it's like there's a particular agenda we're pushing, and you're either with it or you don't get money. And the only real pushback I see is from, like, third world countries in Africa. They'll go to the UN and they'll be like, we're not going to accept these conditions. And it's great. Like, to me, like, that's, I find that fascinating and awesome at the same time, because it shows, even though they're in, like, their country isn't as well off as us, they recognize that they need to hold on to virtue, because essentially I would assume that's what's holding their country together in the first place. Whereas, like, a lot of European countries, and I know you've talked about this, like, are suffering a huge decline in population, where we're going from a pyramid to, basically a straight line, and it'll eventually become a reverse pyramid. The tax base isn't there anymore, and they need money to provide for all the programs they're making. It's easier to, like, almost bully them into accepting what we have to offer. Again, I don't agree with that. Like, but that's, I think, how that interaction's going.
I definitely do think that demographics is a huge issue to why things are changing. DW, the German news network, was basically talking about, like, whether or not you get a pension later on in life, that should be a private matter now. Like, I don't think the government will be able to help you. Sorry, guys. and like that's and even in this news report itself, it was talking about, like, the change of the social contract and things like that are actually a lot more profound than people realize. Like when the state news network from Germany starts talking about a change in the social contract, what you're talking about is the entire end of an era, the emergence of a new, different political system. That's what it means when we talk about the changing of the social contract.
Absolutely.
And it's going to be caused because of the pension problem. And now people think that AI automation is going to solve the issue, but maybe not, because people have been indicating that actually AI is creating a lot of different new jobs. And several things that people thought that AI, like self-driving cars, for instance, seems to be there is a very good debate on whether or not full self-driving is going to be possible or not. And if it isn't, then a lot of jobs, a lot of blue collar work is not going to be able to be replaced, because if AI has a difficulty in navigating the real world, then you're still going to have a labor shortage. And right now, like the U.S. and developed countries in the West has a labor shortage, even with this AI boom. Like, it's not like, I was looking at recent reports that were like from 2 days ago, and it's still very much a problem. It seems to, we just have to look at the numbers. But
Yeah.
um, I think AI will end up creating new jobs as well, and you're not going to have enough people to fill in those new jobs, and it might end up just creating an issue where you're going to have to spend a lot of money retraining people into the new jobs that AI creates. So it might not solve the labor shortage. It might create new labor shortages, and won't that be exciting?
Oh my gosh, yeah, that would be exciting.
But
So for AI cars, what they do is they actually have to map centimeter to centimeter where the car would be going and put it in a database. I used to work for a one of the automobile companies here, and even though I didn't work for them directly, like the AI, I dealt with safety, and so there were some things that they asked in terms of statistics, like what they would want from a safety standpoint. But how they do AI for cars is, yeah, they go centimeter to centimeter. And right now, like, it would be a hard thing to do to say, I come from a rural area. I grew up in a rural area, and if I wanted to go on top of a hill, say like with my girlfriend at the time when I was, in high school, and I wanted to move the car 5 feet to the right on a hill that wasn't cement, they probably couldn't do it. Like, an AI car would not be able to do that right now because it hasn't been tracked, and giving such a command is not the same as saying, I want to go to this destination and find the quickest route to get there. So there's a lot of, like, I agree with you. I think that it would create a shortage. It's being presented kind of like as a silver bullet right now. And I think you're getting a lot of people panicking over it.
and there's a reason why I think it's being presented as a silver bullet. I mean, I don't think it's a. I mean, now it's my time to put the tinfoil hat. I don't think it's a coincidence that generative AI is making such a boom, and ChatGPT was released because right now, right in the moment when the Silicon Valley Bank was collapsing, everyone was talking about a tech bubble that was about to burst.
Yeah.
There were these massive tech layoffs, and the metaverse failed, the NFT stuff failed, the crypto stuff is starting to teeter off, and a lot of these things, like right when that happens, then boom, right, you have this new magical thing from Silicon Valley that emerges out of nowhere, or seemingly does, not really,
Yeah.
but and now you have a whole new slew of investments of people interested, which just injects new life into Silicon Valley. It's not a coincidence, and I remember hearing and reading about how ChatGPT was kind of released to the public before many people thought that it was a little too early. Right, there's this whole debate and and I think it was released too early because they needed to wow people. They needed to be like, no, we have like a chick up our sleeves. Look at this thing, and it worked so far. It worked. Now, this goes to show that there might be a little bit of a desperation going on, where they need new capital, where because a lot of big tech is not profitable, which a lot of people don't know. Now, AI is different from all the other stuff that failed. AI is different from the metaverse. AI is different from because it's actually it produces value. It can actually produce things. So it is different, but we don't know exactly the limits of it as of yet. I think so. We'll just have to see where it goes. I don't think you can simulate human consciousness. If you want to talk about more theology and get to the theology of AI,
Yeah. I mean, we could totally do that. I just want to add one thing. I have actually another channel in my other channel. It's called Learn to Stats. It's where I teach statistics. And one of them is I actually use ChatGPT, and I go through and I'm like, hey, like, can this do a standard deviation? So and I walk through several iterations of me requesting it from new windows. I used ChatGPT 3.0. And the only time it worked was the time The only time it gave me the correct answer was the time I didn't have it recorded. And so like it couldn't even like calculate like which you would think a computer should be able to do. I mean, if your Excel spreadsheet can do it, why can't that do it? Like, and so like I was showing the limitations of it being able to do particular calculations, but if you wanted to write a poem, you know, it can write very beautiful poems. Because like one of the things, you know, when you read articles, they're like, all right, these are the types of jobs that will be removed. One of them is a statistician, which is what I am. And I'm like, no, not anytime soon. Like, not if this, like, it can't even do a basic calculation here.
What about GPT-4? Do you think it's better, or did you try GPT-4? Or
I GPT-4 requires money. And so like I've like right now I'm not in a fiscally okay place to start trying because I would love to actually do that. And from what I've seen from a lot of science professors is that when they give the test to ChatGPT-4, they can get the concepts right, but the calculations will get wrong. And they think it's ironic because that's the opposite of what their students get right and wrong. And I'm like, well, that makes sense because conceptually, like it's easier to do, in my opinion, it's easier to do mechanical calculations than it is to do to think about the conceptual analysis. Both are important, but most people they only focus on what's applicable in the here and now. You know, kind of like the short-term gain thing. And whereas like I'm very much into the concept of the theory of statistics, what it can say, what it can't say. Like for example, you know, this is a pet peeve of mine. Whenever someone says science proves something, I'm like, no, it can't prove anything. Like, it's actually fundamentally impossible for that to happen. You can show that an instance that happened 100% of the time. Like, so, for example, if you showed that I gave you like $2. But in terms of doing statistical analysis, which is the heart of all science, you wouldn't be able to say science proves anything because it's all based off variation. And a proof doesn't allow for variation, which is why you can only do it in philosophy and math. So like, but I know you know that, like from a standpoint of like philosophy, like proofs are in philosophy, and that's why I hold philosophical arguments to be stronger than any scientific ones. When it comes, well, I guess bringing it back, when it comes to theology and discussing whether or not AI has a will, which is essentially like the difference between, you know, that's really what sets apart artificial intelligence and real intelligence.
The limitations of AI a lot of times is because AI is narrow AI, right? So like we have one AI which can do very good calculations, but then it can't write a poem. And then you have ChatGPT, which it can't do math, but it can write a poem, right? And which is why the holy grail of AI would be AGI, right? Artificial general intelligence, but still elusive. Maybe it's on the horizon, maybe it's not. I do not know. But I think when it comes to whether or not AI can be sentient. This is it could be a very interesting philosophical conversation that we can have with this, and theological as well, because if we are imago Dei, right, made in the image of God,
Yep.
we don't really know exactly what that entails. And if God has the ability to create consciousness, I mean, maybe God has given us that ability as well, or maybe to simulate it so well. It won't be as good as we are because God is a better craftsman than we are. But maybe we could simulate consciousness well enough, maybe not never being pure consciousness, but being imago mentis, maybe like made in the image, right? Maybe like we're making these things based off our brains, right? The machine learning is all based on, and so we are made in the image of God, and then we're making AI in our image. So AI is like a reflection of a reflection.
So God did give us the ability to do that, but it's with our bodies. And I would actually make the argument that the whether or not we can do something is a different question than whether or not we should. And go back to Jurassic Park and you know that whole conversation, because it is directly related. Like especially in Jurassic Park, which is kind of pulled it off the top of my head. It is directly related because you're dealing with, supposedly animals, or at least to some people, animals, except they're made of metal and wire. They're not made of flesh and blood. And so, I think that's a really important distinction here when, like you said, you're making a reflection of a reflection. And there's responsibility with that. We're not in charge of the universe that these things are being put into. God is in charge of the universe. And although we trust God, we are making these things more or less without him in mind. And like, that's a huge problem.
Or even trying to replace him, right? According to Elon Musk, like Larry Page, like one of the co-founders of Google, wants to create digital God, and you have a lot of these people in Silicon Valley and that do have like these pseudo-mystical, pseudo-religious views of AI. Ray Kurzweil being a
Well,
big example. Yeah.
well, what's very interesting is Elon Musk, several times is like AI is like one of the greatest dangers to humanity.
Yeah, and I agree with that actually.
Well, yeah, so do I. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like we have technology and we can go so far. Like the nuclear bomb, for example, should have never been made. Like, period. It just shouldn't have never been made. And I do think AI, at a particular point, should not have been made. Like, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying like your Call of Duty like NPCs need to just sit there while you shoot them. You know what I mean? Like in a video game. But like when it comes to the level that we're talking about, like ChatGPT, like that is a dangerous level, and in an interesting and sad way, people have already died from it.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree that you could say that the nuclear bomb shouldn't have been made, but nuclear power is pretty nice, right? And then one disrupts the other. But at the same time, like when it comes to AI, which goes to the argument, like AI for like video game NPCs, that's fine. But the real problem that I have with AI is when we're talking about having like AI administrators that makes policy decisions for humans, and people are seriously talking about this, like seriously talking about AI running our lives, right, instead of us. Like, are we really so like nihilistic? Are we really so like self-hating to the point that we want to improve machine learning and machine decision making instead of our learning and our decision making? Like we are really much. This is the kind of thinking that makes us into a suicidal civilization in a sense, where we literally want to hand over a civilization to another entity just based on an assumption that it will always be better than us and that we can improve ourselves. Uh, um, I think that itself is not what I ascribe to. I prefer keeping human destiny in our hands because God put it in our hands, right? And like He doesn't decide where we go, we do, and that was His decision to give us this power, and we want to relegate that to a machine, right? We want a machine to make those decisions for us. That's very indicative to some of our societal issues. I think some of our civilizational issues. But I don't. I think the dangers of AI, whether or not it's going to be sentient or not, or whether or not, because some of the limitations are going to be, and we don't know what the future is going to hold, right? And we don't know if maybe the economy is going to collapse with the First Republic Bank collapsing now. Like the economy might collapse before we're able to, fund these big projects, and who knows? But um, but as long as machines don't replace human soldiers completely, I think I'm going to be more or less more comfortable because, like, the same principle that applies to governments, right? If the common man, if the common man is not necessary to the power of the state, the common man would not participate in the power of the state. And it's the same thing with the human species.
Yeah.
If a human soldier is not necessary, right, then we're not going to be able to defend ourselves against the machine. We're not going to be necessary for the decisions that the machine makes. I think if things continue to develop and continue to improve, this is one of the videos that I have planned. We are going to have to keep developing technologically, but maybe in a way that improves human capabilities. So like a good example is like going to fiction, just for fun, right? I mean, science. We're living in the age of science fiction. We literally have like, right?
Yeah.
So why not go full crazy? Let's talk about like the concept of the space marine. I think the space marine is an interesting concept. It's basically like a space knight, right? From from Starship Troopers from Robert Heinlein to Warhammer to Halo to all these like famous iterations of the Space Marine.
Yeah.
They have a very medieval component to them, right? They're knights. They're like knights in space. They have armor, which is why they're defined by their armor in every case. And I think the idea of this highly technological exoskeleton, I think that I think is where technology should go, where technology evolves and develops around the human form, in service of the human form.
Yes. Absolutely.
Exactly. So I think so. It's not about stopping technological development. It's about going on the right path to technological development. Because technology is not one linear path. It's a tree with many different branches, and you can go to many different paths, right?
Yep.
And there's a good path and a wrong path when it comes to technological development, and we have to keep developing, but we have to develop in the right way that makes technology serve us and not us serve technology to the point that we might even be completely redundant and it might not even have any use for us, which people talk about seriously. Like, oh, yeah, it's going to be so powerful. We're not even going to be used. Like, do you really want to live in that kind of world? Do you really want to enable that kind of world? It just seems crazy to me.
Joke's on them. They wouldn't be living in that world.
Yeah.
I mean, but I guess like one of the things that I've thought about is when it comes to AI and basically this handing over of responsibility. I mean, even for one's life is, going simply to Genesis, when God talks to Adam about after he bit into the fruit, what's he do? Well, he blames Eve. And then what's Eve do? Blames the snake. And it's like, it's always this, pushing to the side, I don't want to be responsible for this. Let something else be responsible. And, we'll, through our sophistry, justify this thing that we made with our own hands to make the decisions for us. So we'll pretend that this isn't something that we did. And it's like really weird because it's like, no, this is all man-made. This is all like us still. Like, someone asked me, well, what's the morality of AI when the machine's doing the choices? And I said, well, whoever made AI has the responsibility to oversee those choices. And if they start going into a direction that's dangerous, that person needs to do it. And so there is a moral agent there.
I agree. And I think this what you I think you reached a point that I think is very interesting, because I think this is the core of why there's a lot of hatred against God. Is precisely because of this idea of responsibility. Like when you look at Larry Page and these other people like talking about creating a digital God and an AI God that makes all the decisions. Like, God himself doesn't do that. God himself doesn't do everything for us. He created us for us to exist, for us to act, right? Because to exist is to act. So if we're creating these machines to act in our place, we're literally diminishing our own existence, where they all the existing, and we just we sit passively. So instead of increasing human capacity, so I think this idea of being angry that we have to act, that we're the ones that have to make the decisions, and then suffer the consequences of that, instead of just regulating it to someone else. Like we're angry that God made us free in a way, and in that way, I think Catholicism in particular, but also Christianity as a whole, ends up being a very humanist force, even more than humanism itself. Because if you have a worldview where humanity itself becomes divine because God makes himself man. And so you're incentivized to preserve the human form, the human essence of being. You're incentivized to increase human potential and human power to make us resemble God more and more, but of course improve human ethics and human morality, so that we can make good decisions and resemble God that way. And God himself is the story of the Bible being a story of uplifting man from a sinful position to something more. And you have St. Paul talking about new glorified bodies that we're going to have. So it's all about increasing. It's all about glorifying God through glorifying the human, right? And so this ends up being more humanist than transhumanism, which wants to transcend humanity, which wants to move to a post-human order, which wants something else. And that suicidal, this like anti-human nature, I think is, I personally, I would consider it evil. I think if you want, if you want to move past beyond what you are, like why? How do you reach that position? Why, why do you hate yourself so much that you want to,
Yeah, that's a great way of asking that question.
that you want to be something else?
Yeah.